Okay, last but not least, let's do one video on women in the People's Republic of China, and that's going to include the one child policy. And then I'll just refer to minority people in China, but we're going to go over that in class on Thursday and Friday. If you're not in school for whatever reason, it would be a really good idea to email me for extra help. But there's information in the slides which will cover what you would need to know for the quiz. All right, cool. So same stuff. We analyzed some propaganda. And then we did a quick read of this New York Times article. If you lost your copy, you can get another one by just going here to this slide. And then we did a continuity and change exercise. So I'm just going to go straight to that slide, right? So essentially, I wanted to use this. A, it's a really good tool if you're going to take A push next year, and B, I mean, you can already kind of tell there's probably going to be some sort of quiz question that's getting at some of these ideas in this T chart, right? So that's a not so subtle hint, right? So what are ways in which the status of women changed? And we could also consider language to sort of measure that change. Was it a dramatic change? Was it a subtle change? Was it a positive change? Was it a negative change, etc.? So just sort of think about that as we're talking. So one change that's arguably positive was that women got to choose who they married. There used to be arranged marriages. Women were not allowed to file for divorce. And so that does change, right, with new marriage laws. In addition, I'm sort of going to skip around. Did I not talk about concubinage? I guess not. So I'm just going to say it. I think I have it in another slide, so I'll just talk about it briefly. Concubinage and prostitution were also abolished. You know this from class, but a concubine is basically a mistress, right? So that was obviously not very liberating for a woman if you were a concubine. And then, of course, you know why, making prostitution illegal would be seen as a liberating thing, of course, again, for a female who was a prostitute, right? It established more gender equality, arguably, right? Additionally, foot binding was abolished, a long-standing tradition in China, which was much more of an issue with the wealthier classes, because this was seen as a symbol. If you got your feet bound, the idea was that you, A, looked pretty, arguably. Tiny, tiny feet were seen as more feminine. It also meant, of course, if you had your feet bound, that you weren't able to do much, right? You really can't walk particularly well if you have bound feet. So if you were a woman with bound feet, you were more of an ornament to your husband, right? You weren't meant to do heavy chores or anything like that. You were really meant to be an object to bear children, something pretty, right? So when foot binding was abolished, of course, it's a liberating experience in the sense that women no longer were going through this incredibly painful process that arguably violates one's individual human right to be free from torture, right? But at the same time, it was a way to allow more women to work, right? Because now you could walk around in the fields and what have you. So it's interesting to think about how this could be a positive change, but at the same time, there's sort of an ulterior motive. We already sort of talked about how it's important that women were able to work, but women were not paid as much as men if they worked in an area where they still received pay. Just a good saying to know, Mao famously said women hold up half the sky, which of course, again, is seen as a very liberating idea, but what does that actually mean? Women, or young girls rather, that is, were able to go to school, right? Some could before, but it was much more of an egalitarian thing. In fact, all girls were supposed to go to school. Women got the right to vote in 1953, but again, we're talking about a single-party state, so you had the right to vote for communists and nobody else. And then one thing that wasn't in any of the readings, but I mentioned in class, was that another change was literally an aesthetic change. Women in the People's Republic of China did not appear particularly feminine in the traditional sense. So there's actually a clear divide between women in these two photos. It's not super dramatic. Her hair is still not crazy short, but women in the People's Republic were not required per se, but strongly encouraged to cut their hair short, more like a male style haircut. They were encouraged to dress more like men, right, in clothing that they could work in. But it wasn't so much about looking like men per se, but it was more about looking the same, right? And it was also about freeing oneself from materialistic concerns. The theory was that if you had long hair and if you dressed very feminine, that you were more interested in your own personal appearance, which maybe made you seem selfish. But if you did cut your hair short, if you didn't dress in a super frilly way, it was sort of, you were sort of regarded as someone who had more respect and attention towards the collective than the individual. Hopefully that makes sense. Continuity, of course, like we said before in a previous video, you can change the way, you can change the law rather, but you can't change the way somebody thinks. So the best example of that is the perpetuation of Confucian ideas. This also sort of spills into these ideas. This is one of the reasons why men still had most of the power in the Communist Party. It's also the reason why women had the double burden of working outside of the home and then coming home from a long day at work and serving up a meal for her family. And additionally, I think I said before that they tended to have women, that is, had the less desirable jobs. And if they were working somewhere that still used pay and currency, they were paid less. Okay. Then we talked about the one-child policy. This, I don't really want to, I honestly would just tell you, if you guys want to just pause this, if you want to take notes, but I kind of already covered all this in that T-chart just now. So let's get to the one-child policy. As you remember from class, we had a little debate about this, a little discussion. We put this into context, so this chart, and if you're in my A period class, you couldn't see this chart that well. So it's a good opportunity to check it out here, right? This huge drop was during the Great Famine. This spike is actually towards the end of the Great Famine and the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Of course, as we know, Mao believed that young adults and children were sort of the figureheads of the Cultural Revolution. So, of course, having more kids is going to literally power Mao's army. And then you see that once we get into the 1970s, the population was actually rather precipitously declining. And what's interesting is that this, 1979, was the year that the one-child policy was officially adapted. So one could argue, not that it was unnecessary, there was a reason for it, but the timing of the one-child policy, when the population was already declining, is very curious, and we'll get to that more in a second. We read a background guide in class, and then we talked about these in small groups. So basically what these last few slides are answers to these 4 questions. So if you're taking notes while you watch this, maybe pause, write down these questions, and then answer the questions in your notes. Okay? So the first question is, what was the one-child policy and how did it come about? So before the one-child policy started, in fact, way back, literally Great Leap Forward back, and even before that, Mao's first 5-year plan back, Mao believed that the more people there were to work, right? So Mao actively encouraged people to have lots of kids, right? But once the early 1970s roll around, partially because the country was still recovering from the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine, Mao and other communist leaders, it was more communist leaders actually, not Mao, because Mao was very sick by the 1970s. So the Communist Party introduces something called the Longer, Later, Fewer campaign, which explains this, right? People already were encouraged, or discouraged rather, from having kids and having kids too soon. They still were supposed to have kids, but just not as many and not as quickly. So what longer, later, fewer means, longer meaning wait longer to get married and wait longer to have kids, later meaning have kids later in your marriage, right? And then fewer meaning just don't have as many to begin with. And also longer means wait longer in between having kids, right? This was introduced, the one-child policy, the official one-child policy, was introduced in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping. So this is a few years after Mao had died. And like we said before, it wasn't really about decreasing the birth rate. It was partially, but it was actually more about lifting the population out of poverty, right? Because the declining birth rate was one thing, But having even fewer children to care for would mean that, their living standards would improve, that parents would be able to devote more time, effort, and money into raising one child, right? The complications with the one child policy are more about enforcing the one child policy, right? So the, so-called population police, they're literally were people that work for the Chinese government whose jobs were to force women to have OBGYN exams. If it was discovered in these exams that they were pregnant, they often, well, rather, if they were pregnant with a second child, then they would be forced to have an abortion right then and there. And oftentimes, in addition to that, while that abortion procedure was taking place, they would also get sterilized so they could never have a child again. Now, there was a way around the one child policy for some. In certain areas of China, you could have a second child, but you would be charged what's called a social maintenance fee, which is a euphemism for a huge fine. So the Chinese government pocketed lots and lots of money from these social maintenance fees, and they were not the same throughout the country. Basically, the wealthier the area you lived in, the more money you would have to pay for a social maintenance fee. So we talked about Shanghai in class, right? You literally would have to pay approximately 300% of your annual income, so 3 years pay, to have that second kid. So rich people could afford to have a second kid, poor people couldn't, right? So what are some of the unintended consequences of the one-child policy? Arguably, there's two huge ones, and those are the ones I want to cover. The first one is the gender imbalance, and the second one is the aging population. So gender imbalance. Some of this is due to the lingering Confucian traditions in China, but even more broadly, just the fact that most countries are patriarchal. So boys rather, were prioritized over girls. Families figured if they have one shot to have a kid, they wanted to have a boy. And so before 1994, families, if they had an ultrasound and they discovered the sex of their baby and they found out they would have a girl, oftentimes they'd have an abortion right then and there, and then they try again for a boy next time. Also, if they weren't able to procure an abortion, or if they for some reason did not know the sex of the baby and they had a female, they would sometimes literally kill that child. That's what infanticide is. Okay, they might leave the child for dead, they may abandon the child, etc. Best case scenario, I suppose, is that baby girl would be given up for adoption. But then in 1994, the government abolished prenatal sex screening. So basically, you could get an ultrasound, but you couldn't find out the sex of your baby. But people found underground methods to do it anyway. You could pay I don't know if it was a legit doctor, but you could pay a person to give you an ultrasound. And if you found out you were having a girl, then you could get an abortion. So there were still loopholes. But again, that meant you needed to have some money to do that. Despite the fact that these sex screenings were abolished, we know that people were still getting these ultrasounds because still, this is pretty up to date, these statistics here. For every 100 female births in China, there are 120 male births. So this is leading now to a marriage crisis because the one-child policy was just lifted in 2016. So what we're seeing now is that, people of marrying age, many males are unable to find a wife. This actually leads to increased crime rates. It generally leads to a less satisfied male population if they're unable to marry. This also means, and this sort of links to the last consequence, or the second one rather, there's more, but we're just going to really get at these two, is that if you're an only child and you don't marry, then you're burdened with the task of taking care of not only your parents when they get older, but your grandparents. And that's what the 4-2-1 problem is. You're one child taking care of your 2 parents and your 4 grandparents. So basically what's happening since the one-child policy was instituted in 1979, that means basically Chinese millennials and Gen Zers, these Gen Zers who were, Gen Zers are the ones who were affected by this, or they are the products of the one-child policy. By the year 2050, approximately 1/4 of the population of China is going to be over the age of 65. So that's going to mean that the people of working age are going to be burdened with taking care of this population. So that's one of the reasons why the one-child policy was lifted in 2016, was to get more children to, I mean, literally have more kids, eventually get to working age to take care of this aging population. But the problem is that just lifting the one-child policy is not going to just get people to have more kids. It's incredibly expensive to raise a child, and so it's not really working out necessarily the way that the Chinese government had planned, but maybe it's too soon to tell because it was only changed 3 years ago. Okay, we watched this video. All right, last quick stuff. Why are human rights relevant here? Hopefully it makes sense. But one could argue that this is a huge individual human rights issue, particularly for women, but also for the rights. If you are a pro-life person, it's also an issue of rights for the unborn child or the fetus. So essentially, women's personal rights, right, the right to have control over their bodies is in question. The priorities of their health needs, right, and also just the way in which the government is enforcing these regulations is arguably a huge breach of privacy. What's interesting is that 10 years prior to the adoption of the one-child policy, the UN issued a declaration that proclaimed, among other things, that parents should have the right to have as many children as they want, so long as they're doing it freely and responsibly. And of course, you could sort of question, well, what does that mean? That's incredibly subjective. I'm not going to answer that question. It is incredibly subjective, but nonetheless, it's very interesting that the United Nations issued this declaration, and 10 years later, this policy was introduced. So, one could argue this isn't part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's sort of an interesting add-on that the UN included to its sort of concepts of universal human rights. And this all sort of falls under the umbrella of this concept of individual versus collective human rights, right? One might argue that the one-child policy was much more of a collective idea, and everyone had to buy into it. And I've been ignoring the propaganda that I put on here, but, they're just really cool to look at, so definitely check them out. What I'm not going to include in this video is a discussion on minority people in China, partially because you guys have, if you were in A period, I didn't give you the full 15-minute reading time, so we're going to read a little bit more of it in A period. If you're in F period, we're going to probably launch class with a discussion, maybe get like 5 minutes to go back and look at the article. But these are the questions we're going to talk about, so if you want, get ready. Pause and check these questions out. If you're looking at the slides, you can click on this link and read the UDHR again. And then we're largely going to go over it broadly, but we're going to focus on 3 minority groups in China. We're going to talk about the Uyghurs, then we're going to talk about Tibetans, and then we're going to talk about people who live in Inner Mongolia. All right, cool. So, and then after the quiz, we're going to talk about the research project. So that should do it. I hope you guys feel a little bit more comfortable with the material that's going to be on the quiz. As always, ask me any questions you guys might have and come to extra help if you need it. Okay, thanks guys.